Hi everybody. Okay, we're going to talk about wholesale selling channels today, and I'm going to take you through some of my thoughts, some of my experience, and in my view, as I say on the screen, a true brand only exists when it exists across multiple channels. So you can't really have a true brand name and exist in a single channel, for example, Amazon only. So if you really desire to have a true brand and you expect that brand to take a life of its own and become really what people aspire their brand to be, something people rely on, think about, and search after, seek out, in other words, then I think you have to be in multiple sales channels. So I'm going to take you really through this very quickly. Who I am, why is wholesale important, and maybe break some myths along the way. There's some risks and rewards that go along with it, and then give you kind of a little flow chart on how to follow it along. So tiny writing here, but I add my background just to add context. I know that not everybody knows me or knows my experience, so this is why I'm sharing it. I did drop out of college at 18 and bought my first business before I turned 19. So I've been an entrepreneur for a long time. I'm 45 now, and I've been doing entrepreneurial stuff since that time, and even before that time if I really dug deeper. I built a land-based retail store in the early 90s into the top 25 in the U.S., and I started and built an $88 million post-money valuation e-commerce company kind of in the late 90s through the mid-2000s. Eventually exited from through a venture capital fund. I've raised money in venture capital, private equity, hedge funds, and other so-called smart money. I've done lots of mergers and acquisitions, participated in roll-ups and other mid-scale transactions, purchasing and selling companies anywhere from the 10 to 100 million range. So I've been around the block in terms of how to create value and how to create equity in companies, both my own and for others that I've interacted with. And I've served as a chairman, I've served as CEO for companies in US, Europe, and China. So I've gotten around in terms of the geography and kind of understand different cultures and always seek to understand more. I've done a retail rollout in 22 states across the USA, so I understand sales tax nexus and all that better than the average bear. I've done both distribution and manufacturing on a reasonable scale, not a Walmart scale, but over 1 million square feet of production facilities. That's manufacturing, and I still maintain my staff in China for some of my activities that I carry on today. In the 2009, 2010 range, I started a company on behalf of a Chinese manufacturer, and we built a wholesale and retail channel, including some e-commerce, from 0 to 45 million in about 4 years. Building companies to scale is I love the startup and I love the fast growth, and I love, to about the 50 to 80 million dollar range. After that, it kind of gets annoying because there's lots of HR meetings and lots of details that I don't like to deal with. As a side note, for some who've heard the story, my first $1 million day sales attempt was in November 2007, and my first $2 million day was in February 2008. Both of those, we achieved our numbers and had great days. That's a testament about scale, and when we started, we couldn't do 50,000 a month without melting down, and later through systems and systemization and organization, we were able to do literally millions in a single day without melting down. So over time, in summary, I've generated more than $250 million in e-commerce sales and supported another $500 million plus in wholesale sales through companies I've owned directly and through my strategic relationships, everything from being a chairman to being responsible for supply chain and logistics for very large companies. But I have a core philosophy, and it's relevant to you because I believe the world needs more entrepreneurs. I truly think entrepreneurs solve problems, they don't create problems, and the best thing an entrepreneur can do today is start in e-commerce and expand from there. All right, so I want to be very clear about that last point. You always start in e-commerce. Amazon in particular is a great launching pad, and then from there you expand over time as the need arises and if it fits your strategic objective. Okay, so MythBusters slide number 1. So the first thing you see is this blue line, and everybody loves the blue line. Look how big it is, and look at that little red line. Now the blue line's e-commerce, the red line's physical retail. So why in the world would we want to talk about wholesale or physical retail when the blue line's big and the red line's small? That's the question. However, if I share with you that this is a growth rate by channel, you can see, of course, e-commerce is growing faster than physical retail. It's younger and it's less mature, and therefore it has a faster growth rate. Both growth rates, by the way, are decelerating. So, imagine this in 10 years, the growth rates may not be that different from one another. Maybe it's 15 years. E-commerce has still a tremendous runway, but growth is not everything. So let's look at the scale of these two channels. So here you see e-commerce in, let's say 2015 as an example, $347 billion, growth rate 14.2%, terrific, wonderful. But look at that non-e-commerce, $4.5 trillion. That is a lot of money. And if you actually go back to 2012, you see e-commerce was $225 billion and non-e-commerce, offline channels, were $4.1 trillion. The growth between 2012 and 2015 in terms of non-e-commerce is almost, perhaps even more, I'm just doing the math in my head, than the entire e-commerce category. So when we think about, oh gosh, that non-e-commerce wholesale, physical store, it's only growing at 3.6%. But boy, oh boy, that baseline of $4.5 trillion is pretty big. And so it's important that we kind of consider this channel, and that's really what it takes to be a true brand. You'll see down below that this excludes travel and event tickets and things like that. So, this is a very, very good number to consider. All right, so as we carry on and we think about retail sales, this again is in trillions. It's a mind-blowing number, but this is in trillions. So you can see it's continuing to grow. Offline sales are not dead. Now there are some stores that are certainly challenged, but so much transactions happen offline. I think the share of e-commerce is now somewhere around 6 to 8%, depending on who you ask. And it used to be a fraction of 1%. So e-commerce is certainly growing. But the scale of e-commerce, and this is just U.S. retail, but this is a similar story around the world. It doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter if it's Europe or Asia. E-commerce is important and it's vital and it's growing and it's exciting and it's awesome. And I always recommend people start there because it's the best. But offline sales are still extraordinarily relevant. And honestly, that's where the scale comes from. Okay, next slide is some people would think of, kind of who are the top e-commerce companies in terms of revenue. Well, Amazon, of course, number one, not a surprise. Apple, hey, they sell their phones and iPads and so on their website, not a surprise. But who would have guessed Staples, right? Staples is a very large office supply chain. And although the growth rate was paltry based on this data, it is still $10 billion in Staples, sales. And I can tell you in 2015, they did a lot more than this. When I first created these slides, it was kind of third quarter 2015, so I only had 2014 data, but they are continuing to grow at a very rapid pace. Walmart may or may not be a surprise, obviously the largest land-based and number 4 in e-commerce, but this is a surprise to most people. Sears? Who? Right? I mean, Sears was relevant in the 50s and 60s, maybe even the 70s, but give me a break. Yet they are still a top-rated site and do a ton of volume at 4.9 billion. And they are still growing in e-commerce, believe it or not. And Sears has an open marketplace, by the way. Liberty Interactive, not a lot of people have heard of it. It's a portfolio of e-commerce companies and other kind of companies, including QVC, Home Shopping Network. I think they just bought Zulily. There are a number of really good e-commerce properties that are the underpinning of Liberty Interactive's portfolio. They do very, very well, and a lot of people would expect this because they're mostly e-commerce. But QVC and HSN, not solely e-commerce, right? That's the direct selling on TV play. Netflix, again, not relevant to us, not a surprise, but Macy's and Office Depot. So Office Depot and Staples in the top 10. How surprising is that? So this reminds us that, in fact, these are very important channels, even in the e-commerce space. Okay, so when I think about this sort of thing, I like to remind people that there are prerequisites before you try to get in the wholesale business. And the first is e-commerce is a great way to start, and online marketplaces are a great way to expand that start. And ultimately, you're using consumers as guinea pigs, and that's okay. If you try to test or use wholesale customers as your guinea pigs, believe me, you will definitely have more trouble than it's worth. You don't want to ruin those wholesale relationships. They have long memories. The primary selling channels in the U.S. marketplaces are places like Amazon. I mentioned Sears. There's also Newegg. There's a number of other kind of open marketplaces. And then there's some closed marketplaces that with enough work you can get yourself in there. It's a little tougher than Amazon FBA, but there are some ways that you can kind of work in dropship deals or other deals with these guys to test. There's probably, if you include Europe and Asia, probably 50 or more secondary and tertiary marketplaces that may or may not have value to you, but knowing about them is probably important. And of course, having your own website is vital. You know, between your website and Amazon, that's kind of your resume for your product. And anybody who understands wholesale will understand that that is, you know, a good place for you to get visibility. And I think overall having a larger brand footprint helps establish your credibility. You know, your hardest sale is kind of your first sale to a wholesale customer because they go, who's your other wholesale customers? And when you have none, that's a bit of a challenge. All right, so why would people consider wholesale as an additional sales channel? Obviously, there's larger volume order potential, right? Sometimes you will get in-store placement, although there are many cases where that first order in-store they expect to be for free. And I'll give you an example. You know, we thought we were going to do an in-store placement with a large office supply store. They had 1,700 locations. It was $1,000 a store. That's $1.7 million of free product they wanted for their first order. Not ideal, right? And so, you know, we said no way. And so instead of doing that deal, we kind of went a different direction with it and started with drop shipping and some smaller e-commerce driven sales. So you really have to kind of know, you know, the volume potential comes with some trade-offs. Having a commission-only sales force, these are sales agents. These are specialists with relationships with these target customers of yours. Very important. The commission only is important only to say that it's a variable expense, but these guys are the guys with the key relationships, and you have to really sell to them and make yourself important to them. And ultimately, you have to be able to make them money for them to care. And I really do believe that you dance with who brung you. So if you put sales people in there, especially the commission-only agents, you be loyal to them. Take care of them. Treat them like true partners. And don't just try to get the account open and then get rid of a guy, you know, who's making, you know, 5 to 8%. Depends on your product, what you need to pay them. Of course, there are different kinds of customers. You know, not everybody's an Amazon consumer. The guys who buy at Staples and the guys who buy at Sears are very different. I'll give you an example. At Office Depot, most of the buyers on there are corporate accounts or cities or municipality, state, you know, local governments that have open accounts at Office Depot. They're not going to buy on Amazon. They don't have open account on Amazon, and so it's a whole different channel. And it also they're not as price sensitive as Amazon customers at times. Bigger clients will be able to give you move predictions that will help you with forecasting and being able to keep up with demand. You never want to miss a demand. If they give you a forecast and you fail to meet it, they can cut you right out. So you always want to meet their forecast. Even if they over-deliver on the forecast, but you kept up with what was forecasted, you're not in trouble. But if you fail, then there's penalties, there's all kinds of trouble, including losing the account. And of course, you have a lot of unique opportunities to participate in their promotions. They do things, you know, flash sales are kind of like lightning sales and seasonal events and other things that you would never get that opportunity, if you weren't in those channels. And these are, gives you that opportunity to be diverse and to be more than just a single channel player. Now, those were the upsides. Here's some of the downsides, I suppose. They give you very onerous financial terms, 60-day payment, and they still take a cash discount. Now, if they sell or if they buy a bunch of stuff that you sell to them, they often will have a buyback agreement. So 10,000 units and they don't sell it, it's coming back to you. So you got to make sure you only do deals that you really think are going to move. They're going to want co-op. They're going to want allowance for damage or claims or et cetera, et cetera. And this doesn't matter who you sell to. These are all very consistent with these big boxes. Managing a sales force is not the easiest thing. It takes time. And you really have to be committed to treating them as critical partners and without kind of a weekly touch base, you should not expect them to do very much with your brand. They have lots of other things, and those other things probably make them money. So for them to invest their time early on, you really have to earn that trust and that time. And this takes a long time. It always takes longer and it costs more. So you really can't say, I'm going to start today and by next week I'm going to have Walmart ordering $1 million a week from me or whatever. It takes longer than that. You cannot use FBA, so you have to have the ability to control your own warehouse and ship inventory. This is not a deal breaker, believe me. This is something that can be managed. There's third-party warehouses that can handle this for you, but don't think that FBA is the solution. If you don't know what EDI is, it stands for Electronic Data Interchange. It's a 70s era standard, yet that remains the standard today. And so by doing EDI and having access to EDI and being compliant with their other standards, there's things how you label that are unique and different to these channels. And to get compliant with those standards takes time and money and a little bit of learning. Not hard, very easy to get done, but you just have to know it. Each contract is definitely to their advantage, so you shouldn't expect to negotiate too hard because you're just another vendor and they got tons of them. And until your product and until your sales are something that they're concerned about losing, it doesn't matter. They can move on to the next guy. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes the first inventory at retail is often free to that retailer. So we did a test with Sherwin-Williams. They did 88 stores. We did an in-store placement, and every store we had to place the first shipment for free to them. This is not uncommon, and this happens as they do any land-based purchase. They'll typically test in these regions that will represent sometimes it'll span regions, but it'll represent what the potential is for the whole market. If you do well in that test, great, you may roll out to the whole thing. If you don't do well, they may kill it and move on to the next guy. Of course, managing channel conflicts on pricing. They're always looking at Amazon. They have bots that track Amazon prices. So if you're using the same UPC code on Amazon as you are for them, they're going to know if you're trying to sell it cheaper or someone is trying to sell it cheaper on Amazon, even if it's a so-called pirate or a guy who's hijacking your listing, they're going to be very unhappy if they see Amazon consistently beating them on price, obviously. And of course, mistakes can happen, but overall, if you're really constantly or consistently performing poorly, you'll be out. That's not a surprise there. Okay, this is just a kind of a how to do it. So first of all, you want to define your targets, right? Who is right for your product? It's not every offline channel is perfect for your product. That's an assumption, but that's almost always the case. Once you figure out your targeted prospects, the retailers you want to sell to, then you find sales agencies who have a relationship with those potential targets. And of course, you want to then identify the supply chain that each target prefers. Not every big box wants to buy direct, believe it or not. There are many of these guys that prefer to buy through wholesale distributors. And by using the distributor, it can open up an entire world to you that you would have never thought of. And even though they squeeze some margin out of the deal, they add a lot of value by taking care of EDI, and they take care of supply chain logistics, and they're trusted by the vendor. So as long as you get the product to the distributor, a lot of these guys will say, you know what, we trust them as our primary vendor, so we're going to go ahead and put the stuff online, even if we don't know who the end brand is, because we trust the distributor. So it can be a great way to kind of expand into multiple channels and multiple retailers in a quick way. But you're going to want to find that out, and you find that out through the sales agency and ultimately through conversations with the retailer. Once you work through a contract relationship, you go through the negotiating, the sales process. You either get a deal or you don't, and you just keep working it until you get it done. Once you finalize a deal, then you really have to support them and think about how you're going to execute. Right? Fulfillment is vital. Being able to be EDI compliant, being able to do reporting, being able to take care of them is vital. So that may mean you need some extra people on the phones. That may mean you just need to have a third-party warehouse that can handle this, or maybe you want to warehouse it yourself. I wouldn't recommend that, but there's a lot of options there. And of course, all through this, you can do trade shows and press and even crowdfunding can attract these guys. Believe it or not, through some of the crowdfunding things we've done, we've gotten new wholesale accounts we would have never heard about around the world. And it's a great way to kind of get their attention. So there's a lot of ways to do this, but this is a simple kind of way to take a crack at it. So this is, in summary, wholesale is important. You saw the scale of the business. We're talking about trillions. Although the growth rate's smaller and slower than e-commerce, it's such a vast market that it grows substantially each and every year in its own right. And there's just a ton of revenue out there. And of course, that opportunity, there's risk and rewards that go along with that, right? So everything from really crappy payment terms and really hard to execute orders all the way, through to, giant volume that you think you dream of. But sometimes it can be a nightmare if you're not prepared. And again, that nice little flow chart on the how-to process, simple to understand, but it is hard to execute. That's just the way it is in wholesale. So anyway, I hope you found this valuable. If you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Take care.